All right. Hey, everyone. Let's jump into something pretty big for anyone studying international relations. It's a concept called cosmopolitan democracy.
Oh, yeah, that's a hot topic these days, for sure.
It is. And I know that the UPSC exams, especially that international relations paper, can feel like a lot. It's a mountain of information.
It really is.
But that's why we do these deep dives.
Exactly.
We're here to unpack these big ideas. So today, we're going to tackle this question. Can democracy go global? Is that even possible? We're looking at this section from a political science text. It's all about different ways people imagine global governance could work. Actually, it's recommended reading for anyone prepping for the UPSC IR paper.
It's a good one.
Yeah. But
Yeah.
honestly, even if you're not taking exams, it's just fascinating to think about. So get ready. We're going to figure out if democracy beyond borders is just, a dream, or could it actually happen?
It's a question that I think everyone's asking these days, especially with so many problems that cross borders.
For sure.
Yeah.
So, okay, before we get too idealistic, let's define our terms here. What exactly is cosmopolitan democracy? It sounds nice and all, but what does it actually look like on the ground?
So, at its core, cosmopolitan democracy wants to take those democratic values, things like fairness, representation, participation, and it wants to apply them to the whole world, not just individual countries.
So instead of just having democracies within countries, we'd have democracy between countries. That's a big change.
It is, and it's a pretty direct response to how powerful some of these global institutions have gotten, like the World Trade Organization or the UN. And a lot of people feel like the old way of doing things, just focusing on democracy inside your own country, it's not enough anymore in our globalized world.
Right. Think about issues like climate change, pandemics, the global economy. These things don't care about borders.
Exactly.
Okay, but does this mean we're automatically talking about like a single world government? I'm all for global cooperation, but one giant government for the entire planet sounds a little intense.
Yeah, hear you.
Yeah.
And most people who support cosmopolitan democracy, they aren't actually saying we need one world government. What they usually picture is a multi-level system. It's like a web.
Oh, okay, so different levels of government, but they're all connected.
Mm-hmm.
Can you give us a visual here?
Sure. Imagine you have these supranational bodies. That means above the nation. So things like a global parliament or courts. And these interact with national governments, which then also connect with local communities. The important part is no one's in total control. It's about sharing power.
Got it. So it's more about spreading out power, making sure democracy happens at different levels. And our source actually talks about two specific models of cosmopolitan democracy, right? Can you walk us through those?
Absolutely. The first model is from David Held. And he imagines a world where you have this global parliament and then also regional and global organizations that have been reformed, made better. And countries would gradually give some of their power to these institutions.
Okay, so it's like a slow evolution towards global democracy. What about the second model?
All right, that one's from George Monbiot, and it's a bit more radical. He wants a world parliament that's directly elected by people. But here's the twist. The constituencies, the groups of people each representative is responsible for, they wouldn't be based on countries. They'd cut across borders. So you could have like 600 representatives, each one representing 10 million people from all over the world.
Whoa, okay. That is a huge change from how things are now. I can just picture those election campaigns, politicians flying all over the place, trying to connect with voters from every culture and background. That's got to be a logistical nightmare.
Right, but that's the kind of question cosmopolitan democracy has to answer. How do you represent that many people fairly? How do you even manage global elections? These are the big hurdles.
Yeah, it sounds great in theory, but definitely not easy to put into practice. And I'm guessing not everyone is happy about the idea of making nation-states less powerful.
You're exactly right. Cosmopolitan democracy has plenty of critics, and some of them think it's a dangerous idea. They think it could actually make international relations worse.
Okay, let's dive into those criticisms then. What are the biggest arguments against cosmopolitan democracy? Where do people see the problems?
So one of the biggest groups against cosmopolitan democracy are the realists. In international relations, realists believe that states are like the main players on the world stage, and they act in their own self-interest. They want to protect their power, and they're not going to just give it up easily.
So from a realist point of view, states would never really hand over their power to some global organization.
Yeah.
Even if it was democratic.
Exactly. They'd say that any kind of global democracy would be weak, wouldn't have any real teeth. Because in the end, states would still be the ones calling the shots. Global democracy would be more like a show than a real change.
I see. Okay, so realists don't think it's actually possible to have a strong global democracy. What about other concerns? Are there any issues beyond just the realist argument?
Oh, yeah, definitely. There are a lot of practical worries about how cosmopolitan democracy would work in real life. Like one big one is just the sheer distance between these global institutions and the people they're supposed to represent.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's hard to feel connected to your government when decisions are being made on the other side of the world.
Yeah.
Plus, how do you even represent the interests of billions of people from all different cultures and backgrounds?
Exactly. That's a huge challenge.
Yeah.
And that disconnect between global institutions and the people can lead to something called a democratic deficit. Basically, people might feel like their voices don't matter on the global stage, so they just tune out.
So even if we could create these global democratic structures, there's no guarantee they'd actually be effective or represent people fairly.
Right. And then you've got the concerns from communitarians and multiculturalists. They're worried that a global focus would end up ignoring local issues and cultural differences.
Oh, that's an important point. Could a global democracy really handle all the different cultures and values in the world? Would minority groups just get drowned out by the majority?
Those are some of the big fears. And some people worry that in trying to create this one-size-fits-all global system, we might actually end up erasing all the things that make different cultures special.
Okay, so we've got realists worried about power characterization, practical concerns about representation, and cultural concerns about diversity. It seems like cosmopolitan democracy is facing problems from all sides.
It is. But it's important to remember, no system of government is perfect. Every model has its pluses and minuses.
True. So keeping that in mind, let's take a step back and look at some other ideas for global governance. Are there other paths we could take to try to solve these global problems?
Definitely. And our source actually goes through a few other scenarios, each one with its own implications for the future. One alternative is the idea of a multipolar world.
Okay, I've had that term before, but can you explain it? What would a multipolar world look like?
So in a multipolar world, power is spread out among several major states or groups of states. It's a shift away from having one single superpower that dominates everything. Instead, you have multiple centers of power that are competing and cooperating with each other.
So instead of one country calling all the shots, we'd have multiple power players all trying to influence things.
Exactly. And people who like the multipolar idea, they argue that it could actually be more stable than having one superpower, because no single country would be strong enough to dictate everything to everyone else.
I can see that. But wouldn't there still be a risk of conflicts between these different power centers? I mean, competition can lead to tension and even war, right?
Yeah, that's a valid concern. And history definitely shows us plenty of examples of wars between rival powers. But people who support multipolarity say that it could actually encourage more cooperation, because these powers would have to negotiate and compromise with each other to get what they want.
So the idea is that a balance of power, even if it's a little shaky, could actually make countries more likely to talk things out and work together.
Yeah.
That's the hope anyway. And it's an idea that's getting more attention lately, especially with China becoming more powerful on the world stage.
Yeah, that's definitely a scenario worth thinking about, especially as the global landscape keeps changing. What about other alternative visions for how the world could be governed?
Well, one that's generated a lot of debate and even some controversy is the clash of civilizations thesis.
Okay, I've heard of that one,
Yeah.
but honestly kind of makes me nervous. Isn't it a pretty pessimistic view of the future?
It is. It basically says that global conflicts are going to be caused by fundamental differences in culture and religion.
So instead of countries fighting each other, it would be whole civilizations clashing. That sounds pretty disastrous.
Yeah, it's a bleak outlook for sure. And a lot of people have criticized this idea. They say that it oversimplifies things and makes cultures seem like they're all the same when they're not. And they worry that it could actually make prejudice and intolerance worse.
I see why that would be a concern. It seems like a really dangerous idea to spread, especially when the world is already so divided.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that civilizations aren't these monolithic blocks, you know? There's tons of diversity within them. And people from different cultures and religions can and do live together peacefully.
Right. It's about focusing on what we share as humans, not what divides us.
Exactly. And that focus on shared humanity brings us to another important idea about the future, a more interconnected and interdependent world.
Okay, that sounds a lot more hopeful than the clash of civilizations.
Mhm.
What does this interconnected world look like?
Imagine a world where global cooperation isn't just a nice idea, but it's essential for survival. A world where states and individuals realize that their fates are all linked together and that we have to work together to tackle these huge challenges like climate change, pandemics, and economic instability.
That sounds like the most optimistic scenario we've talked about so far. But is it realistic? Can we really move past our own national interests and start thinking globally?
It's definitely a big challenge. It would require a real shift in how we think about things. Countries would need to prioritize global interests over their own narrow national interests, and people would need to develop a sense of global citizenship.
That's a tall order. It's easy to talk about global solidarity, but in practice, countries usually put their own interests first.
You're right, there are always going to be tensions between national and global priorities. But the reality is, in today's world, we're all so interconnected. What happens in one part of the world affects everyone else.
So even if it's hard, we don't really have a choice but to find ways to cooperate. We're all in this together, whether we like it or not.
That's the key takeaway. And it's a lesson that's becoming more and more obvious as we face these global problems that no single country can solve on its own.
Right, so we've got these different visions for the future. Multipolarity, the clash of civilizations, and a more interconnected world. It's a lot to take in. Is there any way to know which one is most likely to happen?
If only we had a crystal ball. The truth is, the future is impossible to predict for sure. There are so many factors at play, and unexpected events can completely change the course of history.
So trying to predict the future is kind of like trying to predict the weather. You can make educated guesses, but you never know for sure what's going to happen.
Exactly. But that doesn't mean we should just give up and say it's all hopeless. Even though we can't predict the future with 100% certainty, we can still learn from the past to understand the present and think about the future.
Right. History can show us patterns and give us insights, even if it can't tell us exactly what's going to happen next.
Exactly. History shows us that power is constantly shifting. Civilizations rise and fall, and new technologies can have huge and unexpected impacts. These are all things we need to keep in mind as we try to understand global politics.
So we need to be aware of these historical patterns and be ready for the unexpected. No getting complacent.
Exactly. And as our source reminds us, we can't just assume that current trends are going to continue forever. What looks like a sure thing today could be completely different tomorrow. Like, remember that example from the source about how everyone thought Japan was going to dominate the world economy in the 1980s?
Oh yeah, predictions about the future are often way off. It's a good reminder to stay humble and be open to new possibilities.
Exactly. And the further we try to look into the future, the harder it gets to be accurate. It's like trying to navigate a maze in the dark.
Ooh, that's a good analogy. So we're basically sailing in uncharted waters.
In a way, we are. But that's also what makes studying global politics so interesting. It's a constant process of learning and adapting.
It's about embracing the complexity and
Yeah.
being willing to question our own assumptions.
Absolutely. Critical thinking is essential in a world where we're bombarded with information all the time. We need to be able to filter out the noise and figure out what's really important.
Okay, so with all these different ideas about the future floating around, where does that leave us with our understanding of cosmopolitan democracy?
Well, it means that even though cosmopolitan democracy might be a good goal to aim for, we have to be realistic about how hard it would be to achieve. It's not a magic solution to all the problems of global governance.
So it's not a silver bullet, but it's still a valuable concept to think about.
Exactly. And we have to remember that there are other approaches and perspectives out there. We need to keep an open mind and be willing to consider different possibilities.
That sounds like good advice for anyone trying to make sense of the world, especially those studying for the UPSC.
Absolutely. The UPSC IR paper is all about analyzing different points of view, understanding the nuances of global issues, and developing your own well-informed arguments.
So this deep dive has been a great way to prep for those exams. But even beyond exams, I think it's given us all a lot to think about. Multipolarity, the clash of civilizations, interconnectedness. These are huge ideas with real consequences.
They are. And before we finish up, I want to mention one more concept that people often forget about when they're talking about the future. It's the idea of unknown unknowns.
Unknown unknowns. That sounds kind of mysterious. What do you mean by that?
It's a term that Donald Rumsfeld, the former U.S. Secretary of Defense, made famous. And it refers to the things we don't even know we don't know.
Okay, I think I'm starting to get it. It's like those unexpected events that happen in life that completely catch us off guard, the things we never even considered as possibilities.
Exactly. And these unknown unknowns can have a huge impact on how things turn out. They can mess up our plans, create new opportunities out of nowhere, and totally change the world.
It's like you're going through a maze in the dark. You think you're on the right path, and then suddenly you hit a wall you never even saw coming.
Perfect analogy. And it just shows how important it is to be adaptable and resilient when things don't go as planned.
So we need to be ready for the unexpected. We need to be flexible, open-minded, and willing to change course when we need to.
That's the key to navigating a world that's always changing and full of surprises.
And we're back, wrapping things up with our deep dive on cosmopolitan democracy. We've gone from, those big idealistic visions to the down and dirty realities of global power.
It's been a wild ride.
Right.
We've unpacked this whole idea of global democracy, we've looked at what the critics say, and we've even considered some other ways the world could be governed.
We even ran into those unknown unknowns hiding out in the future. But before we let everyone go back to figuring out this crazy world, let's try to sum things up. What are the big takeaways you hope our listeners are walking away with today?
I think the most important thing is to really understand what cosmopolitan democracy means. It's not about having one world government that controls everything. It's about bringing democratic values to global decision-making. It's about making sure that people all over the world have a say, not just the most powerful countries.
Right. It's about making global governance more inclusive and representative. But as we've seen, that's a lot harder than it sounds. What are some other key takeaways from our conversation?
Well, we've learned that while cosmopolitan democracy has good intentions, it faces some serious obstacles, like the realists. They don't think countries would ever give up their power. And then there are the practical concerns about representation and making sure everyone's voice is heard.
And those cultural concerns, too.
Right.
Can a global system really work for all the different cultures in the world? Or would it end up flattening out those differences?
Those are questions that people are still debating. And it all comes down to this big question. Can we really have a global citizenry? A group of people all over the world who share the same values and feel a sense of responsibility for each other.
Okay, so we've explored the concept, we've looked at the arguments against it, and we've acknowledged that there's a lot we don't know about the future. But let's get practical for a second. How does all this relate to someone who's, say, studying for the UPSC, or just trying to understand how the world works?
This deep dive has been perfect practice for the UPSC IR paper. Understanding these debates about global governance is key for answering those essay questions and analyzing current events. You'll need to consider different perspectives, evaluate their strengths and weaknesses, and come up with your own informed opinions on these complicated issues.
So for anyone who's hoping to be a diplomat or work in policy, this episode is basically required listening. But even beyond exams, understanding these concepts helps us make sense of the news, politics, and even the choices we make in our own lives.
It helps us connect those big global trends to our own experiences, Whether it's climate change, trade deals, or the flow of information, we're all affected by what happens on the global stage. And understanding how global governance works is essential for being an informed citizen.
It gives us the power to participate in those global conversations and make our voices heard.
Exactly. It helps us move beyond those simple explanations and really grapple with the complexity of the world.
So we've gone from cosmopolitan democracy to this broader discussion of global governance, the challenges it faces, and the different paths the future might take. Before we wrap up, is there one final thought-provoking question you'd like to leave our listeners with?
Well, given everything we've talked about, I think this is a good one to think about. If cosmopolitan democracy, as we've described, it doesn't seem very likely to happen anytime soon, what other options are there? What other ways could we bridge the gap between global decision-making and the people it impacts? Can we imagine new ways to make global governance more accountable, more responsive, and more representative of all the different voices in the world?
That's a fantastic question to leave everyone with. It's a call to action. It's a challenge to think critically and creatively about the kind of future we want to build. And who knows, maybe some of our listeners out there will be the ones to come up with those innovative solutions.
I'm sure there are brilliant minds out there just waiting to make their mark on the world.
Well, folks, that brings us to the end of our deep dive into cosmopolitan democracy and the future of global governance. We've covered a lot of ground, explored different perspectives, and hopefully sparked some interesting conversations along the way. If you found this deep dive helpful, don't forget to like and subscribe for more explorations of the most important topics shaping our world. Until next time, keep those minds curious and keep those conversations going.